All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. On behalf of the South African Chamber of Commerce, welcome. Um, this is part of our How To Guide series, and it is something that we have been working on tirelessly for the last kind of year to 18 months. The whole aim of the How To Guide series for the South African Chamber is how do we get valuable information in an easily understandable way to the community here in Singapore and across Asia. So far, out of all of the various topics we've covered ceasing your South African tax residence, how to move money out of South Africa, how to purchase a new citizenship or residency in other countries. And today we're going to be looking at another hot topic, which I get asked about all the time. How do I go about buying an Australian property? How do I go about financing an Australian property? How do I go about managing an Australian property? So to that end, I thought, why not do another how-to guide series on it? And we're joined here by two of our excellent members today, Darien Bradshaw and Ravin Chatlani. We're going to be covering off, hi Ravin, we're going to be covering off basically 4 questions here today that is going to encompass the conversation. But as we go, please do put your questions into the chat box. And when we get to the end of the 4 questions or general questions, please feel free to continue to throw more questions at us and we'll answer them as we go. So essentially, if I may, I'm the platinum sponsor of the South African Chamber of Commerce. I'm also a board member of the Chamber. Over the last 3 years working with the Chamber, we've kind of built this wonderful organization that's built both society and business networking together in a really professional way. I'm very proud of what we've built. For myself personally, I work for St. James's Place and I specialize in financial planning for South Africans in Singapore and across the region. And like I say, that's why I get asked all of these sort of questions, from taxes to estate planning, property investments, etc. So hence the How To Guide series. So if I may, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So Darien, I'll start with you. Darien is an executive director for One Global Property Services, and they specialize in Australian property. Darien has over 29 years of experience in the real estate industry, with 20 years in Asia. He has a wealth of knowledge in consultancy and agency services with a proven track record in major commercial leasing and residential sales mandates. Thanks for being with us, Darien. Over to Ravin. Ravin is a director of SMATS Group and manages the Singapore, Malaysian, and Indonesian operations of Australasian Tax Services. SMATS Group is the operating arm of Australasian Tax Services. And since 1995, they have managed the Australian tax needs of over 20,000 expatriates and non-resident Australian landlords through its network of 11 offices worldwide. Ravin's main area of Australian tax expertise includes non-resident property investors, expatriates, and migration tax planning. So, gents, thanks very much for joining us this evening. So I think I'll just kick us off with the first question, and this is going to go over to you, Darien. So our first question for this evening is it possible for a non-resident, non-Australian citizen to purchase a property in Australia? And if so, are there any conditions they must meet or additional stamp duties, etc., that they should be aware of when doing so?
Yes, Michael, thanks for the introduction and warm welcome to everyone here tonight. You know, a few familiar faces I can see within the South African Chamber community. So the simple answer is that you're not treading a path that other South Africans have not. And if you look at the Australian population, which is around 26 million, the government aims for a population growth, which has been somewhat restricted during COVID, of around 1%, and about 50% of that population growth actually comes from immigrants who were born overseas. And I was doing a quick fact check, just which I was discussing with Michael earlier. Around 175,000 to 200,000 South Africans have emigrated to Australia, which is, just less than 1% of the population. So obviously a lot of South Africans are choosing the country as their home. The simple answer is that non-resident, non-Australian citizens can buy property in Australia. There are some restrictions around what you can buy. So I do understand part of the journey for South Africans through Singapore might be that ultimately you might want to emigrate to Australia. So that's a longer process. But let's say, for example, you're sitting in Singapore today, thinking you might be here for 5 to 10 years, and you're thinking, okay, I'm looking at markets that I might like to invest in. You can invest into Australia, but the restriction is that you have to buy property which is a primary sale. So that is a property which generally is an apartment, a townhouse, or something which is in a brand new created housing community. The process in terms of investing into Australia is managed by the federal government of Australia through the Foreign Investment Review Board, and so it's generally so. The business that I'm in and have been for 25 odd years, as Michael indicated, is very much concentrating on the foreign investors who are looking at buying to Australia, plus a lot of expats who buy for us, and we're really in that space, which is those primary sales. So apartment projects and townhouse projects in places like Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, which is where a lot of the buying activity occurs. In terms of stamp duties and taxes, there is additional stamp duties and taxes that foreign buyers need to be aware of. We won't go into too much detail today, but there is what's called a Foreign Investment Review Board application, which currently sits at around $13,200 for a property, which is up to $1 million. And then for every additional $1 million you spend, you pay an extra $13,200. And that's managed by the federal government. And then state by state, there are stamp duties. And that really is at the discretion of each state, how much they charge. But generally speaking, it sits at up to 8%. Some states, for example, like Western Australia or Perth right now, if you were to buy an apartment, for example, under $1 million, you get a 50,000 exemption on stamp duty. And if you buy under 500,000 right now, in fact, you don't pay any stamp duty. So yes, there is the ability to buy. There is additional taxes in the form of FIRB application fee and stamp duties, but there is many investors. I think last financial year there was around 8,000 foreign investors who purchased property in Australia.
That's really interesting. So essentially, it goes on a federal level, on a state level, and it all depends where you're looking. And again, if you're looking at purchasing at a certain price point, be it $500,000, $1 million, 1.5, 2 million, there's going to be different considerations for each price point and the kind of property, but it has to be a primary listing property, right?
Yeah, correct. Now it is possible to get, like again, looking at there's very good statistics which come up from the federal government in a centralized website. And look, there is the ability to buy something which may fall, might be a secondary property. It's just the process of buying that property and the ability to buy that property might be a little bit more drawn out over a period of time. But the investors that we're dealing with, certainly, if anyone, I know this leads into probably the next question about finance, etc. But the most important point is that anyone who is on this call right now, unless they're a politically sensitive person, etc., will have the ability to buy in Australia. And just one other thing to finish off with in terms of where the South African community resides. There's about 40 to 50,000 in Western Australia, which probably means mainly Perth, Queensland, Brisbane, and probably the Sunshine Coast down to the Gold Coast for those who do know Australia well, and then Sydney. I think that's really because of lifestyle. Maybe a lot of it's to do with rugby. Rugby is very big in those states and cities as well.
I think it has a lot to do with sports, weather, and culture. You know, we're not too different after all. So that's thanks for the answer there, Darren, and that brings us along nicely to Ravin's question. So I mean, it's possible to buy a property in Australia, but you know, how do we actually go about doing it? I think if we were to say, let's start with finance, is it possible to secure a mortgage in Singapore to purchase a property in Australia? And Robin, if so, could you walk us through kind of what are the typical deposits required and the kind of rates that are on offer for non-resident, non-citizens to do so?
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. Warm welcome to everyone as well. Yeah, thanks for that. Lending is definitely very accessible. So just to let everyone on this call know as well that besides our tax practice, we also run a mortgage broking division at SMATS, where we typically organize lending of up to $500 million a year for investors, both expats and non-residents investing in Australia. So there are options to borrow for non-residents from both banks in Singapore and banks in Australia. All right, so I'll touch on the banks in Singapore and what they can offer us in the first place. Now, the banks in Singapore will offer lending to non-Singaporean who is obviously on an employment pass in Singapore and earning income in Singapore and paying tax in Singapore. The banks in Singapore will typically lend up to 70% of the purchase price or valuation of the property, which means that you'll have to fork out a 30% deposit, right? Besides your stamp duties, legal fees, and other expenses. So typically 70% in Australian dollars, and the banks will lend you, and the interest rates for AUD at the moment from the banks based in Singapore are about 5.5% to 6%, all right, plus or minus. Now the banks in Singapore obviously have only do principal and interest repayments on mortgages, and they will lend on brand new apartments, completed houses, completed townhouses or villas, right? Now, the banks in Singapore can also lend you up to 60% in Singapore dollars if you wish to borrow in the currency that you're earning in, for example. And that same rules apply, principal and interest repayments, and the banks here have age limits up to 70 years of age. All right. So typically, if you're a bit of an older person looking to buy in, you may have a shorter tenure for the mortgage repayment. So your mortgage repayments could be a tad higher if you're borrowing from a bank based in Singapore. If you are choosing to borrow in Singapore dollars, you need to be aware of the currency risk and manage that, because obviously the value of your asset is in Australian dollars and the value of your income is in Australian dollars. All right, so if there's any shift in the currency movement that's not favorable for you, unfortunately, there could be a margin call by the bank who may ask you to top up to reduce your mortgage. All right, so but basically the banks here are very forthcoming with the lending for Australian property. They've been doing it for a long time. One of the things you do have to bear in mind, though, in Singapore, there is a lending framework called the TDSR, which is the total debt serviceability ratio. So when you borrow from a bank based in Singapore, this may affect your TDSR. So if you are looking to buy a property in Singapore, for example, and one in Australia, if you have a sizable mortgage on your property in Singapore, that may affect your lending capacity from the bank in Singapore to buy in Australia. Okay, so that's essentially the basic parameters of the lending from the banks in Singapore. Now the banks in Australia are a lot more aggressive though. For non-residents, they can lend you up to 80% of the purchase price or valuation. So you only need a 20% deposit. And the banks in Australia can lend you principal, can allow you to make your mortgage payments principal and interest or interest only. And the greatest thing about the banks based in Australia is they do not have age limits. All right, so in Australia, you're not allowed to discriminate according to age, sex, or race. So with lending as well, as long as you can prove your income right now, you can qualify for a mortgage. So no age limits on that, which is great. The other thing to bear in mind as well, the banks in Australia will not only allow you to borrow for brand new apartments, houses, completed houses, or townhouses, they will also allow you to borrow for a house and land package. And what that is you buy a block of land and then you engage a builder to build a house according to your specifications. So because that requires a special type of lending where there's lending for the land first, and there is lending for the construction on a progressive basis. Okay. Now, it's also important to remind all of you that when you are buying a property off plan in Australia, for example, from Darien, you only pay a 10% down payment and you pay nothing else till completion. Okay. And that doesn't work in some other countries in the world. So just reminding you of that. And so it's very easy. So what you would typically do in terms of cementing your finances and making sure that you're comfortable with what you can get in terms of financing is you would go and get a mortgage pre-assessment done or mortgage pre-approval prior to the purchase of your property. Now, the banks in Singapore and Australia will allow you to get a pre-assessment or pre-approval done. That gives you a good idea of how much you can borrow. Together with that and the amount of deposit that you may have put together, you can then approach a property specialist like Darien to go ahead and make your purchase. So that is good and safe. And also, for your peace of mind, that's what I would do if I were you.
So many interesting points there, Ravin. Thank you for sharing. Obviously, I think the first question people would ask is, yes, you are required to pay a 10% kind of down and before and at inception, and then the rest at completion. But in terms of the amounts of deposit required on the Australian banking side, so for Singapore you need a 30%. Laying down. How much would you need for Australia? Is there also a 30% rule if you're a foreigner?
No, it's only 20% because the banks in Australia will lend you up to 80%.
Very good. Okay, cool.
Okay. Now, but the banks in Australia will lend you only in Australian dollars, of course, right? So whereas the banks in Singapore can allow you the option to borrow in Singapore dollars should you want to.
Sure. And obviously the attractive thing about Australia is the Australian banks, is that there's no limit on age and that you can do interest only if you wanted to. Okay. So that makes it a little bit more flexible than the Singapore banking sector then. Cool. So Darren, that brings us to the next question. So let's say finance is secure. How do we go about finding the right property? What are some of the metrics that you should look at when considering what to buy? Obviously, it will be personal if this is going to be a holiday home or a retirement home or investment property. But let's start with the idea of it being an investment property.
Yeah. Look, I think the most important, once you've spoken to a mortgage specialist, and the reason that SMATS and One Global are doing this together for the South African Chamber is, we've been working together as companies for more than 15 years. And so the first thing always is to know what your budget is. So once you've worked out what your budget is, what you can spend, then obviously you can get into the journey of really identifying where you want to purchase. I mean, some of the key reasons maybe if you're going to buy something off the plan is, ultimately you're just looking at it as a straight investment, or are you really looking at this as somewhere that you might live in the future? A lot of the investment decisions, for example, for Singaporeans buying into Australia and honkies is around education. So, there's obviously a lot of honkies and Singaporeans who are in their 40s with their kids growing up and they're deciding whether they're going to put their kids into school. For example, in Perth, it's in the same time zone here as Singapore, and it's the closest city. It's probably only like a 5-6 hour trip versus say 7-8 hours. But education is ultimately a really big driver for Singaporeans, especially for secondary school and for university. And there's a lot of South Africans also who are going through that same decision process. A lot of the investment, even on the investment buying decision, even if it's not for a home in the future, is still driven around, where people have actually visited. So, if people have, if part of the, the group on this call, they've spent time in Perth or Sydney or Brisbane and they like that location, you get a warm and fuzzy, and that certainly makes it easier. And each city, has its own idiosyncrasies. We certainly found, if you look at Sydney, this comes down to the education piece. So just to go back a step, the first thing is once you've made a decision that you want to invest in Australia, is you want to get onto one of the localist, big Australian media papers, and just be reading constantly about what's happening in the Australian economy, but obviously around real estate. In Australia, every Australian wants to own their own home. So there's a very high rate of ownership, similar to Singapore, it's sort of 70, 80% plus. So everyone wants to talk about their property. And if you look through COVID, property prices have gone up by 30 to 100%. So if you're sitting down thinking about where your investment decision is, if you've bought in certain places within Sydney, for example, and certainly in areas which are dominated by South Africans, which is the eastern suburbs and the lower North Shore, depending on where you purchase, your prices may have gone up by 80, 90%, depending on the location, which sounds like a lot. But the overall consensus is that in Australia, property prices double every 10 years. And some cities have continued that journey, others haven't. So I think, there's some of the main drivers. So we've already discussed that you're limited if you're buying right now as an investor and you don't have that Australian residency, which probably means you're going to be buying from a developer. So whether it's an off-plan apartment or a terrace home, most of the cities are quite large. And so, as you get closer into the city and the more affluent suburbs, the prices are much higher. And so through planning, a lot of the development is going vertical versus the cities aren't continuing to grow further and further out. So really what you want to do is you want to be only concentrating on developers who've got really long track records or who are public listed. And that will really come down to exploring the locations that you're interested in. But that I think is one of the most critical things. Then obviously, we as a real estate agent, we are licensed in Singapore. So I'm personally licensed and our company is licensed in Singapore and Hong Kong. That's a crucial factor. You want to only be working with licensed real estate agents because obviously if we are marketing any projects, we've got very tight due diligences that we need to do on developers before actually we can even market a project. And most of the projects which are sold off the plan, because most of what we would sell is prior to construction completion. I mean, obviously there will be projects which are completed where apartments have not already sold, because again, it has to be primary. So really, you're buying something off the plan, which means you really are taking a leap of faith with a developer and with the agent who's working with that developer. And nearly every developer, all the good projects in the best locations, developers will appoint an agent who solely and exclusively represents them. So make sure you're working with a good developer, a real estate agent who is licensed. Don't ever work with a real estate agent who isn't licensed. And as part of the process, in addition to getting your finance sorted out through SMAT, the other key elements of course are the property management side. So if you're going to be looking at an apartment which is off the plan, how rentable will it be? So you want to look at what the vacancy rates, all the normal things we think of. What are the vacancy rates? What are the yields that you might get? How easy it is to rent out an apartment that you're purchasing? And unfortunately, in most major cities, the most affluent suburbs, which you're going to buy into, the yields will be very low. But really what you're looking at buying is, there'll be very low vacancies. And really what you're buying into is that the capital gain that you might get may be far higher than if you're buying into secondary locations. So most of what we've been selling over the years has been generally within the CBD itself or within 5 kilometres, notwithstanding coastal locations. Obviously, South Africa has a lot of beautiful coastal locations, and 90% of the Australian population, look behind you, Cape Town, 90% of the Australian population actually lives on the coast. And there's been very strong price growth in regional centres and coastal areas like Byron Bay. If any of you have been to Australia, Margaret River, Noosa, property prices have gone up by over 100% in those sort of lifestyle locations. So, doing your research and understanding that. I think just to touch on really quickly, we've discussed stamp duty. there's also capital gains tax in Australia. So as part of the process, just getting a good understanding of those items as well. What's the currency doing? If you really are thinking right now about buying to Australia, you probably know that the Singapore dollar, for example, is above parity with the Australian dollar. So if you look at a long-term correlation between the currencies, the Singapore dollar looks reasonably strong right now. We know what's happening with interest rates. And then I think just the final thing, which is really important, regardless of where you buy, is what is going to affect future demand and supply in the location that you're looking at buying. There's been a lot of really big infrastructure projects going on around Australia. And, you know, for example, there's a new metro line in Sydney and in Brisbane, which is recently being built, like billions of dollars being pumped into new train lines. And that's like on an ongoing basis, similar to London with the new, you know, Crossrail, et cetera, and the locations where the connectivity is improved significantly. You know, that's certainly probably going to help future price growth. And I think finally, I mean, one of the biggest projects, for example, in Sydney that's going to happen is there's going to be a new airport. So we're already seeing in locations which you just didn't even think about in the past, groups like Fraser's property out of Singapore, who's, you know, they've got a very large property development arm in Australia, as do many of the big Asian developers, you know, especially from Singapore and Hong Kong. They're very good at identifying locations which are growth areas, you know. So I think that all of those elements are important. Education, of course, as well. So I think, look, just to keep it brief, there's some of the key points really to think about.
Like there's a lot of things there, and I mean, it comes down to any kind of investment that you're going to do, be it any asset class, really. You need to start with the end in mind and consider why you're buying it. And kind of then you go to, okay, right, so how much can I afford? And then you look at the key drivers of the things you've mentioned already. So capital appreciation, yield, how close are you to kind of infrastructure? How close are you to education? How close are you to lifestyle areas, etc.? And all of that will give you an idea of what both your capital appreciation and your rental yield could be. So obviously working with a professional such as yourself who knows the lay of the land, understands Australia, understands those metrics is very important, because I mean, for me as an outsider who I've never been to Australia, and I've only just watched you guys, you know, when we play you on the telly for rugby or cricket, you get a feeling for the town and all of that, and some things you've seen on YouTube. But even like you say, reading in a local newspaper, it's not going to give you the correct insights that you need to make an investment decision with your hard-earned money. So yeah, Darren, those are some very good points. Thank you. So that brings us to our next question for Ravin. So let's say we found the right property and we're managing to purchase it. How do we find the right tenants and maintain the property? In your experience, what are the pros and cons and things to watch out for when using professional management services?
Right. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, look, property management, I must say, in my opinion, having you know dealt with property management companies around the world, property management in Australia is very well regulated and very well structured. We ourselves at SMATS have our own rental management or property management division that manages more than 700 properties across Australia. And you know, having that property management, especially with all of us being 7,000 miles away or 8,000 miles away from Australia, having that property manager on the ground or that property management company managing our asset is absolutely crucial. And the ability for them to deliver on the rent so that we can pay our mortgages on time, etc., is something that we should not forget. And a lot of people do that. A lot of people go and say, well, look, you know, I'll just get a mate to go and manage my property and we should be fine. You know, and it doesn't work like that. Yeah, so it's very important that you make sure that you appoint a good property management company to run your property for you. And let me walk you through what a property management company actually does. So when you settle on a property, so settle is basically the term we use in Australia for completing on the purchase of the property. You appoint a property management company who will then help to market your property and search for a tenant. Okay, now they don't just market the property and just look for, anything. In Australia, we have a proper tenant database, which they have to go through to confirm the history of the tenant and the performance of the tenant in other properties previously. So they will advertise for the property. They will look for the appropriate tenant to come in. They will collect the bond and lodge the bond with the bond management agency. All right, so that's crucial as well. And they will then keep the tenant happy, collect the rent on a monthly basis, and deposit that into your bank account on a monthly basis, on a timely basis. They will ensure that your tenant pays on time. If he's not paid on time, he is issued with a letter, right? So if there are arrears, then they need to be addressed. Now, the property managers in Australia as well take on a much larger role in making sure that all your bills are paid. So all your rates, your insurance, and other bits and pieces are tended to. On top of that, they are also very heavily involved in the maintenance of your property as well. So they do regular checks or routine inspections to ensure that everything's going well on the property. If it's not, they appoint the correct tradespeople, which they have approved and dealt with for a long time, to attend to the issue, make sure the repair is paid for and deducted from your rent and your net rent deposit into your bank account. So they do all of that for a very humble fee in Australia of between 6.6% to 8.8% of your monthly rental income that you receive. All right, so you can see that's very, very reasonable, very cheap for all that's done. Like, for example, our property management team charges 6.6% across the board across Australia. Okay, so that's a very valuable service that everyone should take advantage of, especially because it's so well regulated and well managed in Australia. Now, one of the things that they do as well, if there's any disputes with the tenants, they manage that. They can bring a tenant to tribunal if they don't pay on time or they've defaulted on their rents. So they do all that stuff for very humble fees. So for anyone looking at buying, even if you're living in Australia, for all that hassle and all the work that is done, I would still always recommend a property manager to manage all of that for you. All right. And most importantly as well, as a property investor, you want your property to be well maintained so that your value is enhanced for the long term. Okay, so that's absolutely crucial, and a lot of us neglect that and say, okay, let's get the bloke down the street to manage my property for me, he'll be all right. And when you turn up 5 years later in Australia, when you're ready to move to Australia, your property may look like a shambles, right? So that's where having that is absolutely crucial. Now, what I find is having good property management teams keeps the tenant happy and keeps the tenant staying longer in the property as well. Okay, and the property managers also keep up to date with market trends on the rent. So they will be informing you and saying, look, the market strengthened, you can increase your rent now by $30 a week, $50 a week, and so on and so forth. All right. So I think they are a critical component of your Australian property investment, which must not be ignored. Okay. Now, so these are generally all the pros of getting your property management through a proper management company. The only cons I can think about, certain property management companies in Australia are understaffed at the moment. There is a skill shortage worldwide. All right, so most property managers manage up to say 60 to 80 properties in their portfolio. So some very large property management companies are understaffed at the moment. So you just got to be careful who you appoint and find out what their experience is in that area, how many properties that person is managing, and can they give you and the tenant that tender loving care that your property deserves and you deserve. All right, so that's one thing that you should research and find out about their ability to manage multiple properties, and also the other important thing to bear in mind, it's always good to find out that your property management company has got good connections with tradespeople, etc., to be able to manage things in the property for you. So there are property management companies that don't have those great connections. So you do end up paying a bit too much for your repairs and all that. So it's worth just doing some research on that before you appoint the right property management company. And the other thing that a lot of foreign investors sort of make quick mistakes on is it's always good to have your property management company's office fairly close to where your property is. So if there are dramas, if there's a pipe burst or a major leak or something like that, someone can attend to it fairly quickly, right? So if your property is way too far away from that office and the reaction time is slow, then there could be, it wouldn't be that great for you.
Ravin, based on everything you've said there, obviously it sounds like it's a valuable service and a value add that an investor would definitely want. I mean, who wouldn't want to have a property maintained and to make sure that your rent is payable on time so that your bond is paid, So as a follow-up to that, I just have 2 questions for you. So in terms of let's say now we've settled on a property and we're about to take a tenant. Does the property management company also kind of do the contract, the lease agreement? Do they write that up for you?
Yes. So they manage all of that paperwork between yourself and the tenant. So they manage all of that. So they're familiar with all the terms that are normally used in terms of the 6-month lease or 12-month lease and so on and so forth. They will discuss with you. So they will approach you and say, okay, we found a good tenant. We've done our tenant checks. We've filtered. We found a perfect candidate for your property. And he wants to rent your property for $600 a week for 12 months. Are you comfortable with that? All right. And maybe if you have done your own research and you found out that the market actually tells me I can get a bit more, you can have that discussion with your property manager and say, look, I'd like, a bit more. Can we get it in this market?
Yeah.
And so, so they manage all the paperwork. You don't have to do anything. And they record that paperwork. They keep that there should you wish to check it in the future.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important because especially from a Singapore perspective, if you are a renter, if you actually review the terms and conditions of your lease agreement or contract, it's very heavily favored in the landlord's favor. And so making sure that, you are represented correctly as the owner of the property in Australia is obviously the property management services job. So that's great. 2 tax questions for you, one relating to interest and bond repayments and the other to the cost of property management services. So in terms of the income or rental yield that's generated by these properties, are these tax deductible expenses?
Yep. So you're referring to property management fees being tax deductible? Yeah. So Australia is very generous with its tax deductions on rental properties. So write down property management fees, the interest cost on your mortgage, insurance, all the necessary maintenance and repairs expenses, all of that's fully tax deductible. And Australia even gives you an added deduction, which is depreciation on the property, which is an allowance that you're given pretty much free of charge. So when you complete the purchase of a property, you get a depreciation schedule done. So that helps to minimize any tax liability on your income every single year.
That's brilliant. And in terms of the bond repayments and interest on the bonds, is that also tax deductible?
When you're saying bond repayments, are you referring to the rental bond? So that means
your loan to the bank.
The principal portion of your repayment, correct? So yes. So the principal portion of your repayment is not tax deductible. Okay. It's only the interest portion, which is why it's always beneficial, ideally, if you can, to take an interest-only mortgage.
Yes.
Because you get a full tax deduction on that.
Brilliant. I mean, it's very similar to South Africa in that regard then, in terms of what is deductible, but that depreciation piece sounds like it's quite beneficial to the landlord.
Absolutely, very beneficial, and that helps a lot of people. I haven't had to pay tax on my rental income for many years from my Australian properties, and that's a big thank you to depreciation. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I think any tax advisor who can say that is the person you want to work with. So we've had a number of questions come into the chat box here, and so the first thing that I'd like to cover off is, so Darien, this is perhaps something for you. Is there a, oh, sorry, let me unmute you. There you go. So in the UK, obviously a big kind of property sales term that's going around is the whole buy to let concept. In Australia, is there a similar concept, and is it as popular?
Yeah, very much so. So, you know, certainly, I mean, there's one item that we've slightly touched on, which is negative gearing in Australia, which is obviously to do with being able to deduct the costs of renting out a property. You know, we talk about being able to deduct your interest payments. So if you have an interest-only loan, obviously that's tax deductible, and in addition to that, depreciation. So, look, many Australians own multiple properties in addition to their primary residence. So the buy-to-let concept is alive and well. And, you know, in terms of, for example, in Sydney, about 35% of the population, for example, lives in apartments. So the buy-to-let is alive and well, just like it is in London. So in addition to selling Australian property, I've been involved in selling, you know, hundreds of apartments in London as well. So I think that the London and the Australian property markets are very similar in terms of the being familiar with the buy-to-let concept.
Brilliant. And another one for you, this comes back to our second question about kind of identifying the best property for you. In general, what are the rental yields that you've been seeing when you buy an investment property in, say, Perth or Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne?
Yeah, so right now, for example, we're selling a property in Perth for a group called Finbar. They're a large public listed developer. I think they've got 76 projects under their belt. And in East Perth, for example, you can buy, if any of the viewers know East Perth, a property which faces straight north. You see the Swan River, the Western Australian cricket ground, which is about to be redeveloped. So for a 1 or a 2 bedroom apartment in there of between, say, $500 and say $750,000, the rental yields are probably between 4.9 and just under 6%, which is seen to be quite strong. That's on a gross basis before you take off any of your costs, you know, in terms of renting out the property, etc. If you were to go to, so that's literally a kilometre from the CBD, so the main commercial district. There's Curtin University is moving their campus into the Perth CBD. So within a 5-minute bus ride, a free bus ride, you'll be at Curtin University, where there's 11,000 students and teachers and staff. You know, so that's something which is very strong. But if you took a similar location, for example, in Sydney, so the Sydney CBD, inner eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, where your entry level price for, say, even a 1-bedroom apartment would be, say, 1.2 million, a 2-bedder, 2 million plus. And, you know, there's many projects that we've been involved in selling where 3 beds start from 5 million Australian dollars and upwards. Clearly, it's a lot more about owner occupiers because of the price tag, but obviously the quality of the tenant that you would get in those types of properties are very high, but the yields, just because of the value, is very low. So it becomes more about a capital gains proposition or two, and most importantly is for, you know, given that Australian property prices in major capital cities double every 10 years. If you've got people who are looking at emigrating to Australia and they want to find a place that they possibly could live in the future, you know, that's probably going to come at a higher price tag. So lower North Shore, for example, Sydney, you might buy a 3-bedroom apartment, 3.5, 4 million. You might only get a 2.5, 3% yield, but at the same time, if you move in 5 years, that $2 million property might be worth $3 million versus, you know, something in Perth where the capital gain might not be as high. So it's really it's a balancing act between really what you're looking for.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to, what do you want to achieve with this property? Is it a capital appreciation project that you can reside in the future, or is it solely for income generating purposes? I think that's very clear. Thanks, Darren. Ravin, I know you touched on it earlier, but if you wouldn't mind repeating it. So you were saying that mortgage rates in Singapore, we're looking at between 5.5% and 6%. How much were they in Australia? I have to unmute you. Sorry. Here you go.
Yes, yeah. So mortgage rates in Australian dollars from the banks based in Singapore are about sort of 5.5 to 6%. From the banks based in Australia, they are about 5.5 to the lower sixes, maybe 6.1, 6.2. Now, this is all dependent on the size of the mortgage you're taking. Is it under $1 million? Is it interest only? So there are different considerations in terms of the interest rates. There are fixed rates. In Australia, you can fix your rates for up to 5 years as well, if you wanted to. So there are those options as well. So typically 5.5 to 6 in Australian dollars across both Singapore and Australia. In Singapore dollars is a tad cheaper because the cost of funds for the Sing dollar is cheaper. So it's about 5% at the moment, but just bear in mind that you've got to fork out 10% more of a deposit if you're borrowing in Singapore dollars as compared to Australian dollars from a Singapore bank. And if it's Singapore dollars versus Australian dollars from an Australian bank, then there's a 20% deposit differential. Yeah. So, you know, how much do you want to put in?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the next one is right now there's a global energy crisis. How is this impacting ownership of property in Australia, if any? Darren.
Maybe what I'll talk to is what that impact is having on construction costs. So the big topic right now is you know, this obviously relates directly to that in terms of the movement of resources which are used for building. So construction costs have gone up by 30 to 40% in Australia. It just depends on the city. And what we're finding is that people have been investors and future owner occupiers have been buying properties off the plan. And what's happened is the developers have costed what they think it would be to build, taken a view on pricing, and then sold out, you know, enough so that they can get construction finance released. And there's a lot of examples right now where the developer is then realizing that their cost has gone up so that there's no margin. So they're then having to go back to buyers who have forward purchased and said, right, we can't afford to build at this price anymore. By the way, prices have gone up by 30, 40% during COVID. Unless you're prepared to put an extra 10% on the table, they'll transparently open up their books and say, right, this is exactly what the costs were then, this is what they are now. And if you want to walk, you can, here's your 10% deposit back. And what you always find is in the best locations with the best developers where that does happen. And unfortunately, it's a factor of the market right now is that there's many instances, especially with small boutique projects, which might be overlooking Manly Beach or Cottesloe, in, you know, where it's very, very difficult and the planning process is very long and convoluted to get those sites in the first place. So we're talking about very rare commodities. Is most buyers, if they can see transparently that cost has gone up and prices have gone up and they're really thinking long term, they'll put their hand in their pocket and spend that extra money. But that's been a really big factor. Front page of the Australian Financial Review again today.
I mean, it seems to be a problem everywhere, especially you're looking at the UK market as well, and it's showing no signs of slowing down.
Michael, I'll just add, so just one thing to add there, is that the upside of that is that if we look ahead, the peak of the market in Australia was, say, 2015-16 in terms of new supply, in terms of apartments. That was sitting at around 25,000 new dwellings being created in 2015-16. Next year, that's going to be down as low as 10,000. So if you're looking at the supply side going down, but long-term demand still being strong, obviously that sits well with price growth if you're looking at it.
I mean, supply and demand metric there is very much in the investor's favor long-term. I like those odds. So the very last question, we'll close out on this one, guys, and I think this is something that both of you could hop in, is let's say that any of us on the call here had a Australian spouse. Would that differ very much to what we've discussed here broadly? Does that open up additional properties that you can purchase? You know, can you buy things that are not off plan? And does that also change kind of the dynamics for financing options?
Yeah, I think maybe Ravin's best place to answer that now.
Yeah, so basically, if you have an Australian spouse, one of the things, so as a non-resident, as a non-Australian citizen, you can only buy brand new, right? If you have an Australian spouse and you choose to buy the property with the spouse, you can then buy established properties in Australia. Okay, so what we call in the secondary market, or what we call in Singapore, second-hand properties. So you can do that. In terms of lending, you do have an option then to borrow from a wider variety of Australian banks. So as a non-Australian citizen, there are a few banks that will lend you, and they lend you at about 5.5 to the early 6%, as I mentioned earlier. If you are married to an Australian spouse, we could have preferential lending terms. So there'd be more banks that would come to the party with the lending. And at the same time, the interest rates would probably be lower, say between the high 4s to the mid 5s is what you can achieve on investment property lending at the moment for an expat.
Okay.
And there's one other really important point as well, just to add to Ravin, which Ravin and I are discussing with buyers all the time, and that is, if you buy under the Australian spouse's name, firstly, I mean, there might be considerations, obviously, how the income is distributed between the spouse and the non-resident, which obviously a unique case by case. But if you buy under the spouse's name who has the Australian residency or passport, you then don't have to apply and pay the FIRB payment that we talked about earlier, which could be $13,200 plus, and then obviously the foreign stamp duty, which is 5 to 8%. So you can have some significant savings, but you need to look at it case by case, depending on where the income's coming from, because that will determine what you can borrow.
All right. So, I mean, that was the second part of this question in the chat box here, is just saying, look, if I'm the person that is the kind of the source of the income that would be paying for the mortgage, does that mean even would that would affect the ownership kind of metric, right? You would have to jointly own it and then go to the bank and say, the income's coming from this person. Are they still going to look at you as an Australian? Are they going to look at you as a non-resident? It's very much case by case, hey, Ravin?
Yes, it is case by case. We do have lenders that will allow us to buy just in the name of the Australian spouse, but both the Australian spouse and the non-Australian are co-borrowers. So we do have those options as well. So that way it's the best of both worlds, because you save on the additional buyer stamp duties and all the rest of it. But like you said, it's a case by case. The bank needs to look at the case, look at the income, and make a decision on the lending.
Very good. Guys, this has been a really informative session. I feel like we've covered a multitude of topics here, from kind of the yields that we're looking at to where to buy, what are the things you should consider, mortgage finance, taxes, everything. It's really been kind of the whole block of everything you can consider for Australian properties, which is what I wanted to get out of today for our community here. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Awesome, guys. So before I let you guys go, the very last question would be, how do people find you? So Darren, what is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
So I'm active on LinkedIn. So if in the aftermath you provide details, Michael, then my details are all here. I'm also, like Ravin, we're both based here in Singapore. I've got an office just off Orchard Road. We've got a really lovely old heritage listed sales gallery and shop house. So, it's easy for us to sit down and meet with people here in Singapore.
Very good. And Ravin, your side?
Yeah, so we've got an office here. We're just off Bugis in Sim Lim Tower. So we're just next door to a big electronics mart, so it's easy to find us. Yeah, so you can. Now I'm on LinkedIn. Frankly, if you just Google my name, I think you'll find me. Yeah. So I think after this event, I think if you look at just the event invite and just type in my name, you'll find me there. And for those of you who need a bit of an initial, chat, initial discussion on moving forward with a potential purchase of a property or just investigating this, one of the things I can do is I do provide a complimentary initial consultation for up to 30 minutes just to look at your situation, assess your situation, give you the right advice on the best way forward and your options. And then you can decide what you want to do, whether you do want to buy something or, you know, take a breath for a while and not do that right now, depending on your circumstances. All right.
Very good, guys. Thanks so much. And everyone, obviously there will be a follow-up email. There will be contact details shared, and it's very easy to find all of us. I think the world is so connected today. You can find us all on LinkedIn quite easily. And very lastly, I've just got one more thing to share. So we at the South African Chamber, we have one more event coming up that I think everyone would find some interest in, is with the Singapore Stock Exchange. So with the Singapore Stock Exchange, we're hosting at their offices, and we're talking about how you can list in Singapore and then you can secondary list in Johannesburg. So if you incorporate a company here and you take it public in Singapore, you can immediately secondary list in the JSE for secondary round of funding. So the JSE is going to be talking to us about this next week. Sorry, not next week, in next month in October. So if you'd like to join this, please get in touch with me and join the conversation. So everyone on the call, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a good one. Please follow us on all of our social media channels and visit our website, www.sacham.sg. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a nice evening.
Thanks. Good
Cheers,
night.
guys.